Good afternoon. Welcome to the Scientists for Future webinar series. Through this webinar series, we explore how to go forward in this decisive decade. As scholars and scientists, what is our role in contributing towards the rapid and far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society that have been called for by the IPCC reports? In particular, what system or cultural changes need to be discussed more widely and how best to communicate that? So for today's seminar, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Paul Raekstad, who will be talking about some of the social causes of climate change and what we can do to address them. It seems to me that this is a question that many people within scientific and academic communities are asking themselves at the moment. I feel that this is stemming from the realization that decades of climate research and multiple IPCC reports haven't resulted in policies that sufficiently address the enormity of the climate crisis. Before I give the floor to Paul, we thought it would be nice to warm up the audience with a quick survey of their thoughts. So if you would please go to wooclap.com, that's www.wooclap.com/XGCPKU, you'll see a question. So the question is quite open, but we're hoping you could give a relatively succinct or brief answer just so we can get the feeling of what people's thoughts are around this question. And the question we're asking you today is, what do you feel are the main obstacles of collective climate action? So I suspect that there's probably quite a lot of overlap here in people's feelings, but then it might also be some quite unusual answers, and perhaps that can give some thoughts towards the questions later in the session. So while you're filling in your answers, I'll continue my introduction to Paul's work. Paul received their PhD from the University of Cambridge, where they researched Marx's critique of capitalism. Paul is now a faculty member at the University of Amsterdam in the Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences, where they're based in the Department of Political Science. Paul works on methodological questions in political philosophy and theory, democracy, future economic institutions, and how to bring them about, perhaps most importantly. Paul's talk today will discuss some of the social causes of climate change and what we can do to address them. Paul will look at how our current economic system is driving the climate crisis, why our economic and political systems are failing to address this crisis, and what social movements need to do to change that. Okay, so we've got some answers coming up here, and I can see, I'll read out a few of them. One is money, a lack of political will or corporate corruption and lobbying, dominance of the short term of economical and political systems, lies and dependence on the fossil fuel industry, and awareness of the changing market. So that's a lot of answers. Some are still flying up here, and so you can see different people's answers, I think, if you're also looking at the app. But I think for the sake of time, we'll move on now to see what Paul can tell us about this. So I'm going to hand over the floor now to Paul to start their talk. Thank you.
Okay. Gonna try sharing my screen first and see if that works. Okay, let me know if that doesn't work. So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Paul, and thank you very much for having me. I want to start by doing something I like, which is stealing a good idea that a friend of mine had. So a friend of mine often talks about one of his favorite films, which is also one of my favorite films, namely The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. And one of our favorite lines in that is one of Gandalf's lines to Frodo. So Frodo is bemoaning the fact that he's stuck with the ring and the awful situation that he's in, and says, "I wish it did not have happened in my time." To which Gandalf responds, "So do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. That is given us." Now, I think Gandalf's line perfectly encapsulates one of the most important insights that I see in various areas of human thought, from like the earliest texts in Taoism to contemporary realism in political theory. And it's essentially this: we can't choose most about the context, the situation, the society that we're facing. We're in the situation we're in the natural, social, and historical context that we're sort of essentially born into, whether we want it or not, whether we choose it, whether we will it or not. What we can do is choose how we act given the situation that we're in. For example, in order to change it for the better. Now, to do that well, we need to do something that is often cognitively and emotionally difficult for us. We need to start by accepting and trying to understand the situation we're in and what we're really up against. If we need medical treatment for a serious illness, we have to start from accepting the fact that we're probably ill, go to somebody to get a good diagnosis of what it is that ails us, and then look into what kind of cure or treatment we can get for that. So too, I think, is the case with the climate crisis. We need to start with accepting the situation that we're in, no matter how hard that is for us, and I think it is quite hard, diagnosing its causes and its conditions, so that we can then figure out a sensible cure and treatment. And again, this can be very difficult to do, but it's what I think might empower us to bring about the change that we need. So there's a kind of classical quote that's often misattributed to Einstein that goes as follows: the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And again, as far as I can tell, Einstein never actually said this. It's probably from like an early Alcoholics Anonymous thing a long time ago. That's actually really problematic for other reasons, but I'm not going to go into that. But I want to say that there's a similar line that says, like, look, if you're trying to do the same thing that everyone else is doing, but you're expecting to have different results, that's kind of arrogant as well, because it relies on the assumption that you are somehow magically better and more likely to be successful than everyone else who's tried it. Now, I think the climate movement has been spending a lot of our time doing things like setting up NGOs, appealing directly to politicians, lobbying, and so on, which are things that have completely failed us so far. So let's start, I think, with some very, very basic things about the problem we're in, right? Very, very briefly, and other scientists have done this work, so I'm not going to really discuss it at all. Greenhouse gas emissions are fueling a global climate crisis. Now, we actually do have the technologies we need to solve this crisis. So what is it that's stopping us? It's not the lack of evidence. It's not the lack of really good data. It's not the lack of really solid theoretical research or the absence of a scientific consensus. And it's even not a lack of good and accessible explanations of that science. Anyone can go on the internet and find excellent explanations of the climate science if they are so inclined. Nor is our problem that enough people don't actually know about this and don't support reforms. So, for example, the UNDP's recent People's Climate Survey found that out of 1.2 million surveyed in 50 countries with 56% of the world's population, as many as 64% believe that climate change is, quote, a global emergency. And even in the US and the UK, you have clear majorities supporting most measures associated with solving the climate crisis, like phasing out all fossil fuels. Our problem is our economic and political systems are not responding to this. And I think we need to ask the question of why this is. Now, we often think about the people we're trying to appeal with and address and see before us as a kind of isolated, atomized individual, rather than in terms of the wider societies or ecosystems that they are part of and that shape who they are and that also shape their behavior. And I think this approach is disastrous to us, because it's only by understanding the natural, social, and historical context that someone is in, what shapes them, what incentivizes them, what constrains their actions, and so on, that we can understand why they end up acting the way that they do. So let's talk briefly about part of that ecosystem that I think is really important here, namely our current economic system, usually called capitalism. So Nietzsche has this famous line that, it's impossible to define anything that has a history, and so too for human institutions, because they have a history, it might be impossible to give a really good, precise definition of any of them. But we can, looking across history, see that capitalism, our economic system, has a few basic features that come in sort of almost all its guises. So first of all, capitalism is characterized by the private ownership of the means of production, fields, factories, workshops, etc., and a class division between those who own and control most of the productive property, i.e. capitalists, and those who do not own or control it, but work for capitalists for a wage, namely workers or proletarians. Famously, capitalism also has free markets in labor, and labor under capitalism is free in like two distinct but complementary senses, right? So first of all, workers aren't forced to work for any one particular capitalist, unlike, for example, a feudal serf or a slave. On the other hand, they are also free from access to the means of production, which means that they are effectively forced, if they want to live decent lives, to sell their labor to capitalists in return for a wage that enables them to buy the things that they need: food, clothes, shelter, etc. And finally, we have competitive markets in goods and services where different producers, different capitalists, both sort of individuals, but these days especially large corporations, compete with each other to sell their wares and maximize profits. Now, there are three main causes or three main reasons why this system tends to cause environmental destruction and prevents us from addressing it, despite the massive costs to human and non-human animal life on our planet. And the first is that capitalism generates and requires continuous growth. And this tends to lead to increasing pollution and economic devastation, ecological devastation. So in a nutshell, the sort of slogan is infinite growth on a finite planet is impossible. So put more precisely, capitalism entails infinite growth in GDP. Growth in GDP generally leads to increased throughputs of matter and energy, and increased throughputs of matter and energy on the finite world tends to lead to the destruction of the natural environment, including but not limited to by increasing emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, there are different explanations for why capitalism has this need to grow. One explanation that's typically favored by Marxists is that firms have to compete with each other and do everything they can in order to maximize profits. If they don't, they'll just get outcompeted by those that do, and they'll risk going bankrupt or getting bought up by those who are more successful in competition. Now, this leads to an economy that, as a whole, is continuously striving for economic growth and expansion at all costs. If all sort of firms in the marketplace are continuously trying to maximize profits, the only way they can succeed if there's continuous growth in the system as a whole. There are a bunch of other models that start from different assumptions, but primarily assumptions of, money exists in the economy and investment and production take time. And they find consistently that positive growth rates are necessary in the long run in order to enable firms to make profits in the aggregate, and that this finding is robust with respect to different model assumptions. Now, what's most important here for our purposes is not the theory that tries to explain why capitalism needs infinite growth. I mean, I think it's important and interesting, but it's not the most important thing for us. What's most important for us is the observable fact that this is what we see in capitalism throughout its entire history. And traditionally, this is lauded by economists across the political spectrum. And as far as I know, there's actually no evidence that the economic system we have is compatible either with a steady state or with a degrowth economy. And importantly, none of this is about anyone's individual motives, anyone's ideology, or even an individual person's values. It's about the inherent demands, incentive structures, and tendencies of a particular economic system that's only been with us for a few centuries of human existence. There's also a long-standing and well-supported correlation between GDP growth and emissions of greenhouse gases. Despite this, the World Bank, the OECD, and many other powerful institutions have been promoting the idea of green growth, which assumes that absolute decoupling of GDP growth from resource use and carbon emissions is feasible, and that is feasible at a rate sufficient to prevent dangerous climate change and other dimensions of ecological breakdown. There are two problems with this theory. The first is that there's no empirical evidence that is possible or feasible in the long term on a global scale. Minor problem. The second minor problem for the theory is that, as a recent survey article put it, and I quote, "Global historical trends show no evidence of absolute decoupling, and 21st century trends show no greater efficiency, but rather worse efficiency with recoupling occurring." Now, the authors of this article go on to write, and this is a longish quote, "The empirical data suggest that absolute decoupling of GDP from resource use, may be possible in the short term in some rich nations with strong abatement policy, but only assuming theoretical efficiency gains that may be impossible to achieve in reality. B, is not feasible on a global scale, even under best case scenario conditions. Even under best case scenario policy conditions. And C, is physically impossible to maintain in the longer term. In light of this data, we can conclude that green growth theory, in terms of resource use, lacks empirical support. We are not aware of any credible empirical models that contradict this conclusion." So in other words, there's no reason to think that green growth is feasible. We can ignore the available empirical evidence, or we can accept what the evidence suggests, and we can act on that basis. Now, you might ask, why can't we have growth that effectively internalize and incorporates costs to the environment in a sensible way. And the problem is that under the system we have, costs borne by third parties are effectively externalized in market transactions between buyers and sellers, and so they're ignored in them. So from a very particular perspective, environmental destruction is effectively a massive cost borne primarily by later generations or later versions of us, depending on how old we are. And initially, of course, they will be borne primarily and initially by the most poor and marginalized people. Individual producers and consumers don't pay for the real costs in terms of life, illness, and other harms that are experienced by the victims of pollution, of those injured in, say, unsafe workplace environments, or future generations harmed by climate change. As a result, the prices in competitive markets don't take these costs into account. And this is also why public goods like breathable air, clean water have always been traditionally ignored by capitalist markets. Again, this is not about individual bad motivations or values or things like that, but about the incentive structure and tendencies inherent to a particular economic system. Those corporations that don't externalize these costs will be outcompeted by those that do, and are able to thus have lower costs and higher profits, and thus those who don't externalize the cost will be outcompeted, and they'll either go bankrupt or likely go bankrupt or be bought up. Now you might be wondering, can't we trust politicians like governments to see this and do something about it? And the answer, sadly, seems to be no from like the last few decades of all of human civilization. And the reason seems to be because the corporations that are doing these things in order to maximize their short-term profits and competitiveness effectively control huge amounts of wealth and power, which they use to dominate the political system and through that advance their own short-term interests over all others. So we know, for example, that the top 1% is responsible for double the carbon emissions of the bottom 50%, and that the wealthiest 5% alone contributed to 37% of the growth in carbon emissions from 1990 to 2015. Now, this is well known, but it's actually even, I think, less important than the finding that only around 100 corporations are responsible for about 71% of all CO2 emissions. Now, what's important here is not just the emissions of these elites, but their political power. Empirical studies find that while the vast majority of citizens have no significant political power, wealthy elites and corporate interests do. A study of the United States found that when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. This is not just a US problem. A recent study replicated these findings for the Netherlands, finding that in the Netherlands, responsiveness is strongly skewed toward wealthier citizens. And when preferences between income groups diverge, only the higher incomes have an effect on policy change. It also found that when preferences diverge, citizens with low or median levels of income have no discernible effect on policy, while the effects remain strong for the 90th percentiles of income. And the fact that this holds both for the US and the Netherlands is really important, because while the US has a two-party system, first past the post voting, strong presidency, very high income inequality, the Netherlands has a bewildering array of political parties, a much more proportional representation, low income inequality, and so on. So there's very good reason to think that these findings will generalize for other countries as well. And interestingly, this used to be a shared assumption among liberals, conservatives, and socialists alike. They all used to assume that just having suffrage would not necessarily give most people any significant political power. Now, the reason this is a problem for the climate movement is the same reason why it's been a problem for many other movements in the past, in particular movements like the labor movement and the civil rights movement, which is that ruling elites use their political power to prevent policies that reduce their power or damage their chances at short-term profit-making. And this in turn results in them preventing policies that would adequately address climate change. So, you might, you've heard the slogan, the climate is changing, why aren't we? Essentially, this is the answer to that question. These three reasons, infinite growth, ignoring externalities, and massive inequalities of wealth and power, are the structural problems that are driving the climate crisis and also preventing meaningful action on it. So, the famous author Upton Sinclair once said that it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. And sadly, this is true for all people, not just for men. The problem the ecological movement is facing is that the people with the power to make the decisions on ecological policy, major capitalists, corporations, politicians, have a vested short-term interest in keeping things going as they are, at least until they're forced to change. They know the change might be coming, but they're delaying it as much and as long as possible in order to maximize their short-term profits. You might ask why they don't take a more long-term perspective, why they don't change their mind in response to evidence, why they don't seem to care about their children, all of this. These are all kind of like interesting questions from the point of view of human psychology, but I don't think they're the most important ones for the movements to be looking at right now. Because the fact is that these things, as a matter of fact, aren't swaying the opinions and actions of ruling elites, and we have to deal with what seems to be affecting them and act accordingly. So at heart, what we, the ecological movements of the world, need to do is change the actions of some ruling elites, corporate executives, politicians, and economic and political bureaucrats. Our problem is that in practice, it's their job to maximize short-term profits, which means minimizing their expenses. The measures we need for a livable planet, in effect, typically are short-term more costly than keeping going with the status quo, and that's essentially our problem. Now, to understand their actions again, we need to understand. So again, to understand their actions, we need to look at it in terms of the ecology, right? In terms of the natural, social, and historical context they are in. And it's important to understand that the people who are in positions of power are overwhelmingly selected because they have proven their ability and willingness, especially the corporate elites is who I'm talking about here, because they have proven their ability and willingness to maximize short-term profits regardless of other things. They have been and continue to be rewarded for doing that. They're punished if they don't. They can be reprimanded, demoted, or fired. And if they don't do that, they might easily just be replaced or neutralized by somebody who does. From the perspective of a corporation, if we convince individual CEOs or executives that we are right and they should do something that doesn't maximize short-term profits, they're a bug that can and will be neutralized or removed. And again, corporations have been designed and redesigned over centuries to be extremely good institutions at doing this. Now, an important part of the job of corporate elites is to pick the most profitable options, or what seem to be the most profitable options. They look at the options available to them, and they see, and this is, if you think this is a dramatic oversimplification, I agree. It very much oversimplifies in order to make one particular point that I think is important for us to recognize, which is that they look at the options available to them, and they see that solving the climate crisis means choosing options that are, in the short term, likely to be more costly and so less profitable. So very abstractly, we can represent the choices as between two sets of options. A set of options that involve destroying the environment, which has a higher short-term expected payoff, and a series of measures that will help save the planet, but which has a lower short-term expected payoff. Their job is always to pick the option which is most likely to generate the highest short-term profits, which sadly is a version of A above. Our job, the job of ecological movements, is to try to get them to pick B instead. So our situation is the following. We can't change the fact that ruling corporate elites are being driven by power and short-term profits right now. Long-term system change would be good, but right now, this is not something that is happening. Nor can we afford to delude ourselves by pretending this isn't the case. We also, most of us, cannot change the value of option B right now. A few people can. People work on like more efficient solar cells and so on. They're working to change the value of option B, and that's great. But most of us are not doing that, and we're not able to do that. What most of us can do, however, is contribute to a movement that helps change the value of option A. How? By reducing its payoff or increasing its costs through things like civil disobedience / direct action. So, we've seen that the reason we're having so much problems creating the change we need, despite it being in the obvious long-term interest of basically everyone, is that we face entrenched elite interests that oppose us. This makes our situation actually much more similar to poor people's movements of the past, movements like the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and so on, who could not rely on the outside support of a major empire or world power, unlike many of the examples of regime change that XR and many others base some of our / their research on. And I think the examples of things like labor movement and the civil rights movement should be studied much more closely in order so that we can learn from them. So if we want the government to change its actions, what have we got to do to achieve this? I actually think we might not need to actually convince most people, since most people don't control government actions anyways. Convincing a decently large group of people is important for things like recruiting people to get engaged in civil disobedience and direct action. It's important for recruiting people to a wide range of other important things that help and support and is part of the movement, help make it politically unfeasible to just murder or repress the movement. to change the basic standards of legitimacy and justification in our society in a more ecological direction, and a lot more. But it's not clear that any of these things alone will do anything to change the actions of politicians, because, as we've seen, the opinions and preferences of most people don't actually impact the actions of politicians to begin with. So, what we definitely have to do then is get the ruling elites to do what we want, because they are the ones who have the economic and the political power needed to bring about the changes we need. Convincing them by good arguments, overwhelming evidence, moral appeals, and heartfelt symbolic actions clearly has not been working at all. Nor did it work for movements by the most dominated and oppressed people in the past. Now, one of the most important books I'll recommend here is a book called Levers of Power: How the 1% Rules and What the 99% Can Do About It. If you read only one book about social movements and activism, please, for the love of God, read this book. The lesson they have is clear. Movements by the 99% win by a combination of disruption and dividing elites. I'm going to more about disruption than division right now. Dividing elites makes it easier for movements to win. This division can be pre-existing, but can also be created by movement themselves, for example, by forcing the interests of different elite groups in society apart from one another. What I instead want to focus on is the importance of direct action, of disruption. Now, in terms of action, in terms of political actions we can take to try to influence elites, there are three kinds of actions we can imagine. One is things like voting, campaigning, calling our elected officials. The evidence suggests that these things do very, very little indeed. The second kind of action that can be taken is lawsuits. These can impose costs in terms of money and public image. They can also help to shift the terrain of struggle in beneficial ways. And they have some, albeit often quite limited, effectiveness. And they're also a thing that most people can't engage with or participate in very actively most of the time. What works best again and again is what's called disruptive direct action. And I really want to be precise about this. Disruption here doesn't mean annoyance, doesn't mean inconvenience, doesn't mean powerfully symbolic or even chaotic. Disruption has a very specific meaning here that's often misunderstood. And by definition, disruption is just the application of a negative sanction. It's harming directly interests, for example, short-term profits. And examples of disruption are things like strikes, blockades, boycotts, divestment campaigns, sabotage, riots, and so on. These apply a negative sanction because they directly harm the short-term profits of powerful elites, with the effect of, at least in successful cases, forcing them to give in to movements' demands. I'm going to quote from Levers of Power here. These disruptions increase the costs of the status quo from elites' perspective, especially when the actions directly undermine business profits or the functioning of state institutions like the army. So let's go back to our starting point between the two kinds of options that face elites. Yeah, yes, I will. We have A, ecological devastation, and we have B, saving the planet. If we want them to pick B, how do we do that? We do that by reducing the expected value of A, by increasing the cost associated with it, and thus reducing its expected payoff. How? By undermining the power and profits of elites if and when they pick some version of A. And we do that through things like strikes, blockades, boycotts, sabotage, and so on. This will cause ruling elites with the real power to make the choices that we need them to make. If the movement succeeds, it causes people with real economic and political power to choose the option that the movement wants, because it is the one that ruling elites think has become the least costly and thus the most profitable in the short term. Now, here's important to keep in mind. It's not just costs imposed that are important, it's expectations or fears of future costs being imposed. So, for example, when Bismarck introduced some of the first welfare state reforms in the 1880s, or when France introduced the 8-hour day in, I think, 1919, they weren't only worried about the cost already being imposed by radical social movements. They were worried that if they didn't start making reforms, revolutionaries would win and overthrow them and their elite friends. Now, direct action campaigns can have these effects in various ways, right? They can force ruling elites like corporations and wealthy individuals to put pressure on politicians to implement the kinds of changes needed, changing laws, implementing new policies, and so on. Civil rights movement did this to great effect. They can also get the state to step in on behalf of the sort of perceived general interest of ruling elites, even when many ruling elites actually disagree with this or oppose this. And labor reforms during the 1930s in the United States, brought about by a host of radical strikes and other campaigns by workers, seem to be a good example of that. Thirdly, they can make certain investments seem inherently risky and unprofitable in their own case, causing, for example, corporations to just look elsewhere directly. And judging by the historical record, I think the first two options are more likely to be the most useful ones, both in general and for the ecological movement in particular, but that is somewhat of an open question, I think. Crucial point, however, is that leveraging change cannot be done by changing public opinion or putting pressure on elected politicians directly, at least this seems to be the result of the history. The primary targets for levering change must be the incredibly wealthy and powerful multinational corporations and wealthy ruling elites in general that are causing the climate crisis and also preventing political action on it. Now, to be clear, this is not about getting corporations to care more about the environment. They will still only care about their short-term bottom line. But if we can hurt their bottom line enough to pull around the ruling elites to do what we want, then we have a chance to win. So Martin Luther King recognized this when he said that if you can pull them around, so the merchants/capitalists around, you pull the political power structure, because really the political power structure listens to the economic power structure. So if we know we need disruptive direct action, the next question we are faced with is, when is disruption most effective? And looking at the history, we find that it's most effective when it directly targets corporations and state agencies. By threatening the profits or functioning of these institutions, and I'm quoting from Levers of Power here, this popular disruption can compel their leaders to accept progressive changes in government policy. Since these elites are usually the key roadblocks to change, and since they possess enormous power over what the government does, it makes more sense to target them than to focus on elected politicians. Their responsiveness to movement demands doesn't spring from their goodwill, but from a rational cost-benefit analysis of their interests. If subjected to mass pressures that disrupt their profit-making or their institutional functioning, these leaders will naturally seek to cut their losses. Conceding to movement demands often becomes the lesser evil option. If movements can force a change in these elites' cost-benefit calculations, progressive government action becomes much more likely. So, direct action that disrupts profit-making and stability offers elites effectively a choice. They can ignore the movement, they can try to repress and co-opt the movement, or they can try to give in to movement's demands. Very often they will try a combination of all of these things together, including trying to divide the movement into different blocks, co-opt some, repress others, etc. What movements need to do to win here is they need to make sure that the costs are too high to be ignored. They need to make sure that they are not able to be repressed and co-opted, especially that they are not sufficiently divided by ruling elites. So that giving in to the movement's demands becomes elites' only viable option. What should they target? Specifically corporations and state agencies. And there are numerous examples of this working, but the classic organizations are labor movements, civil rights movements, and others. I think I'm coming to an end. What should I do? I want to read two quick quotes before I go to the last slide, because I think this is an important example. So let's consider one example from the civil rights movement that I think is worthy. Namely the campaign that led to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So reflecting on the failure of an earlier campaign in Albany, Martin Luther King Jr. said that these were marches to the city hall trying to make them negotiate, where if he had centered our protest at the stores, the business of the city, then they could have made the merchants negotiate. If you pull them around, you pull the political power structure because, and this is the thing, if you pull the political power structure, if you pull them around, you pull the political power structure, because really the political power structure listens to the economic power structure. They came to the conclusion that they would have much greater success if from the start they had targeted business leaders, and this informed their subsequent campaign in Birmingham in 1963. Other tactics having failed, they turned to imposing direct economic disruption to force economic elites to give in to their demands. Wyatt Walker, one of their most important strategists, said that in Birmingham, we decided we would concentrate on the ebb and flow of the money downtown sea. So all our concentration was on affecting the ebb and flow of commerce and industry. Now, Dr. King confirms this shift, saying that we concluded that in hardcore communities, a more effective battle would be waged if it was concentrated against one aspect of the evil and intricate system of segregation. We decided, therefore, to center the Birmingham struggle on the business community. Now, One of the business leaders leading desegregation was the real estate developer Sidney Smyer, who was a long-time racist and pro-segregationist, who had done a number of things, including leading a group opposing desegregation efforts in the Methodist Church. Yet he went on to lead desegregation efforts in Birmingham in what King called the Accord with Conscience. Why? Well, he's actually quite direct about this. He writes that, well, so after the campaign, the Birmingham campaign was launched in 1963, so April to May 1963, Smyer was called by Robert Kennedy and reportedly met with the president. He convened the city's business elites in a meeting that Sidney Smyer himself described as follows. I guess at that meeting was, I expect, nearly 100 of them. The leading businessmen of Birmingham met and just talked it out and let it be known that you were hurting Birmingham. You was hurting business. This, that, and the other. I think that was the climax. We had a big meeting, and a person after person just got up and said, gentlemen, we've got to get this thing straight. Sidney Smyer didn't have any more to do with it. I mean, that was just a feeling. Well, you might say it was a dollar and cents thing, and the report says he laughs. If we're going to have good business in Birmingham, we had better change our way of living. Now, in 1963, he says, as he puts it, he was, quote, still a segregationist, but, and I also quote, not a damn fool. And it's hard to get any clearer statement of their motivations. In order to have good business, they needed to give in to the demands of the movement that was harming their business, even though they did not disagree with the movement's ideals. And we know what happened afterwards. The campaign lasted April to May 1963, at which point Birmingham elites came around to supporting desegregation and making concessions. Only a month later, in June 1963, President Kennedy proposes a new civil rights bill. It ends up getting stalled, Kennedy gets killed, and it eventually passes under Lyndon B. Johnson in, I think, July 1964. This should not be confused with the later 1968 Civil Rights Bill, which Lyndon B. Johnson signs during the riots, which they rightly predicted would follow King's assassination. I'm going to have one more quote from an important historian of this movement. The historian, in this case Payne, writes that the reference to business as usual can be taken literally. Protesters learned quickly that economic interests were among the most important determinants of how people responded to the movement. When southern cities were caught up in demonstrations, they learned certain elements of the white community tended to be the first to want to negotiate an end to them. If motivations were largely moral, we might expect educators or ministers to be disproportionately represented among those leading their communities out of turmoil. In fact, they were marginal players in most cities. The group most consistently playing the progressive role turns out to have been business people, and their motives were pretty straightforward. Demonstrations were not healthy for the bottom line. Black activists routinely combined sit-ins and demonstrations with boycotts of downtown merchants. Even when that was not the case, the fear of turmoil tended to keep both black and white shoppers at home, a de facto boycott. Cash registers fell quiet. In the ensuing peace, in the ensuing silence, southern business people could think a little more clearly, and the more they thought, the more it seemed like they could put up with a little desegregation after all. And this is something we see time and time again, which is essentially, if you want to win, if you want the social movement to win against entrenched elite interests, what they need to do is systematically disrupt their power and profits, thus undermining their bottom line. If you can do that, you can make the cost associated with the worst option higher for them, and thus make it the case that the best short-term investment or the best short-term actions seem to them to be giving in to the movement's demands. So in summary, we need to drastically and rapidly reduce emissions, and as we know, this is not yet happening at all on the world scale. There are structural features of our current economic and political system that are driving the climate crisis and preventing it from being solved. And those structural causes are the drive for infinite growth, the ignoring of externalities, and the massive inequalities of wealth and power in our society. For decades, the climate movement has focused on popular education, party politics, and NGOs. This has proved woefully insufficient at best. It's woefully insufficient at best. To get results, we must make it in the perceived interest of ruling elites to support the policy changes we want. This requires threatening their short-term profits and stability, which incentivize the elites and the government to give in to our demand. And the best way of doing this is through large-scale social movements that carry out actions of direct action / civil disobedience. That's what I had.
Great, thanks, Paul. So now we're going to have a questions and answers session. So there is, maybe Paul, you can stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, I can. Well, I hope I can do that. Let's see.
Great, perfect. So if you didn't get the link to the platform where we had the survey at the start and where you can ask questions, I think it will be sent in the chat again. And while the audience starts writing down questions, I have a first question myself. It's maybe not the easiest one because it's also something I'm struggling with quite often. So as you summarize again at the end, there is some structural issues in our current political and economic system that make it very hard to address the climate and ecological crisis at the scale that it should be addressed. But you also say that the best way to manage to reach our goals is to make something in the best interest of companies' business or of the economic elites, that it becomes the best, that what we want becomes the best option for the bottom line. And what I'm wondering is, when you need such systemic and structural changes, how can these sort of changes become in the best interest of the people that currently are in the top 1% or the top 5%?
So I guess the shortest and most general answer I can have to that is by really harming their bottom line for not doing what the movement wants, right? So an example of this would be like large-scale strikes during the 1930s in the US, as well as sit-ins. Well, the sit-in strikes were a kind of strike, I guess. And one of the things that did was cause a huge loss of profits, as well as a great deal of social and political instability. And that caused the government to try to step in on behalf of the perceived interests of their other elite friends in order to try to stabilize things by giving in to some of the demands of the movement. And what they did was institute like workers' protections, a bunch of like laws that helped protect workers and ensure say unionization rights and other things, in order to try to, and this actually succeeded, gradually disarm and defang the movement, but in ways that also involved very significant concessions. Now, in the case of the civil rights movement, this is perhaps a more, I guess, easier thing, right? So in the case of the civil rights movement, the campaign I mentioned in Birmingham in 1963, April to May, what they did was cause very significant profits, and they let it be known to the ruling elites of the city that the way they could stop this disruption is by giving in to their demands. And that led to these business elites, again, literally meeting together and deciding they should give in to these demands, despite the fact that many of them, Sidesmar included, remained committed pro-segregationists and racists. And the reason they started pushing for desegregation was because the actions of the movement was harming their bottom line so much that they saw this as their best option to save their profitability and to save their wealth, essentially. And this also led to them not only taking action sort of directly on the level of sort of Birmingham, but also to put pressure on the president to introduce national legislation, i.e. what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I think in principle, something similar could be the case for the ecological movement.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Actually, I just saw there's a question from the audience that kind of builds on that. So I'm going to ask this one now. So that person says, so in past struggles, it was possible for corporations to give in when you had this kind of strikes and other sort of direct actions. But in the case of climate, for instance, for fossil fuel companies, there is no, they can't really just give in. Their whole core business must actually die. So how does that change the analysis, and how, like, what sort of action can we take to, wipe out fossil companies? Direct quotes.
Yes, so I'm not actually sure that's correct. I think fossil fuel companies are often also, or so I've been told, also often investors in some of the green energy sources as well. And fossil fuel companies, you can harm their profits in various ways. And they can, in principle, change quite significantly, right? If it becomes much too costly to extract oil and natural gas, they will shift to something else that they think can be more likely to be profitable. And if you disrupt, again, their profits significantly enough by making it, say, de facto impossible, just way too costly to keep going as they are, they might also put pressure on governments to help, fund them and create and implement a set of policies that forces all corporations, not just them, to transition away from fossil fuels, and might also give them incentives and some support to make that easier and make that happen more smoothly. So I think there are two things. First of all, fossil fuel companies can give in to demands both directly by shifting their investments and shifting their business model, and indirectly by putting pressure on politicians of various kinds to implement new policies. And secondly, we can impose costs on them, for example, by disrupting pipelines, oil extraction, and so on.
I have a more general question. So you mentioned all the issues that are associated with our current economic system. So someone was asking, so since communist systems have been as bad in pollution as capitalist systems, should we also acknowledge that in analysis and solutions?
I'm going to assume that by communist system, the question asker refers to what's called centrally planned systems. So there's a wholesale debate about how to define communism among both people who like and dislike various kinds of socialism. And historically, yes, but I want to say two things. So number one is, one of the advantages of central planning and really any system that is not a very competitive market system is that it does not contain these inherent structural drives towards greater emissions and towards greater pollution, right? So there's no inherent necessary drive towards infinite growth under a system of planning, whether that's top-down central planning like in the Soviet Union and within many state sectors, for example, today, or whether it's more bottom-up participatory planning as advocated by, for example, advocates of what's called participatory economics and various strands of anarchism and syndicalism. That goes for at least two aspects, right? The infinite growth imperative is simply not there in these systems. And the second is that this drive to ignore externalities, this continuous incentive to ignore externalities, is also not there precisely due to the lack of a competitive market in these systems. So in those systems, it would come down to essentially political will. What I do want to say that in all likelihood, in order to begin to address this crisis, we need to introduce some form of planning, either bottom-up or top-down, because that seems to be the only kind of thing that over time will be able to address these kind of problems in a long-term way. Short-term, we need to really focus on direct action, but long-term, I do think we need to transition away from some system of competitive markets and towards a system that incorporates greater and greater planning, ideally, in my view, of much more bottom-up varieties, and there are a number of models I can recommend for that. The one I favor is participatory economics, but there are also more top-down ones that in principle can secure the job that I think will be worse overall for human beings and the world.
Okay, and so regarding possible changes that we can ask for and the impact they can have on changing the, on impacting the perception of what's best to do for these companies, there is a question on some examples of things taking place now. So how do you see the effect of the EU's demand for double materiality reporting and the increasing investor stress about losing their assets as a result of planetary destruction? Do you think these sort of things can be a vehicle for change?
I guess two things. Like, it's better than not having them there in terms of being like significant vehicles for change that on their own or with other things that are currently prevalent will be enough to give us the kind of changes we need on the scale we need with the speed that we need them. I think they're woefully inadequate.
Yeah, that was a short answer. Thanks.
A long answer, I think, would
definitely.
Details, so.
I have some questions that relate more to the disruption and direct action part of your talk. So the first one is a demand for suggestions. Which targets would you suggest could be most effective for disruptive actions in the Netherlands? Would you say it's more the fossil industry or ministries or even other groups for which disrupting the profit could have a more dramatic social effect?
I feel this is a legally exciting question to answer. No, so again, what are the best targets will always depend on conditions, and I don't necessarily trust myself to have the best knowledge of local conditions in the Netherlands. We do have an extremely major harbor in Rotterdam that has a lot of things going in and out of it. Like a lot going in and out of it. And that might, for some people, look like a very, very tempting target. But I think the key thing is not perhaps which things I think are best targets. I think what makes most sense for activists to do is come up with sort of a concrete power mapping of which like major corporations have the most money and the most political power, and see which things that they own and they rely upon for their profit making that can be most successfully targeted. And to successfully target them, you need two things. First of all, it needs to be the case that they are very significant contributors to their profit making, or they have a kind of structural and strategic importance to this corporation. Second thing they need to consider is, can we, with the resources we have, the people we have, realistically stop this thing from functioning in a way that really hinders it from being able to work and or like imposes massive negative costs by our actions. I think these are the questions to answer. I think they should be answered by people on the ground doing the things and who have done much more concrete research to determine exactly what the main kind of nodes that it makes most sense to target are.
Going back to questions that are more about the economic system, someone is asking whether moving away from competitive markets wouldn't kill the entrepreneurial energy that's needed for developing, for instance, alternative sources of energy, alternative sources of proteins, and things like this.
So this relies on a bunch of assumptions about human motivation and behavior, and also societies that are essentially factually mistaken. I can't go through all of them, but I will mention two things. First of all, we already have all the technology we need to successfully transition away from things. More would be great, but we have plenty. And what's really missing is the political will necessary to do it and the structural drivers of climate change. Having more entrepreneurial spirit will not do anything to remove the structural causes that I've mentioned. So even if it's the case that we have a loss in entrepreneurial spirit, in all likelihood, that's a loss that will have to be dealt with and accepted if we are to transition to any kind of economy that can be ecologically sustainable over the long haul. So that's one thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that the myth that competitive markets are particularly good at dealing with innovation is not actually well supported by the evidence we have available today. So I think the book you should read on this is a book called The Entrepreneurial State, which goes through how the fact that most really big new technologies that are invented are developed and invented not by free market corporations, but overwhelmingly by various forms of state funding. And how are most of these made? They are made by people who are interested in things, who are very good at their things, inventing and coming up with new things because they are employed to do so, and not because there's inherent direct financial incentive for them to do what they are doing. So I think you should pick up that book and essentially change your mind. Very briefly, a classic example of this is all the main components in your iPhone were invented not by the corporation that sold you the iPhone, but by primarily US government funding.
Great, thanks. Great information. Everyone's going to get out of this webinar with a reading list. This is very nice. Yeah, I have another question, which is, okay, so based on the analysis that you presented, how will this impact the broadening of our movement to, for instance, the labor movement?
I'm going to interpret this not in terms of prediction of effects, but in terms of what are the implications for what I've been saying in terms of we should be aligning with the labor movement. So I think actually this is really, really important. Arguably the most successful movements in much of the world over the last few hundred years has been the labor movements. And there's a few reasons why. One is the fact that they've been able to motivate and organize a large number of people, and to some extent still are organizations with some membership and power. The second reason is they're very well situated to disrupt corporate economic interests, right? Like the workers who work at, say, a harbor or a major factory, they know exactly how to impact, how to harm the profits of the corporations that own or control, for example, that factory, right? And they do that by shutting it down. And they're well situated doing so. They often have a certain amount of legal protections as well that ordinary activists in other situations don't have, which were won through their successful struggles. So I think one of the implications of what I'm saying is that the climate movement should, and to some extent it's already, many parts of the climate movements of the world, especially parts of XR, are already well aware of this and doing this. I'm not saying anything they don't know here. But one of the things that I think really needs to be done and should be done is allying with the labor movement. And as part of that, I think it's really important that part of the focus and part of the demands of the movement appeal to the broader interests of poor and marginalized people in society. That includes working class people, it includes people of color and so on, in order to help people see, especially the people that might be more willing to organize along these lines and take these kinds of actions, so that it becomes obvious to them that even according to their short-term interests and their immediate lived experiences, transitioning towards a green future can really help their lives and their situation.
So going back to the point about the bottom line of companies and making them do something because they think it's going to be better for their business. So one is asking how corporate greenwashing factors into this. Wouldn't just corporations find ways to appear to give in when they're actually not doing the work? But for instance, yeah, I'm thinking about Shell, who's doing a lot of communication, but how much they're investing in renewables when it's actually about the same amount than their marketing budget. So how would this factor into what you were explaining?
Yeah, so this is a very good and important point, because this is exactly what they are doing and what they will keep trying to do for as long as they can get away with it. I think the key thing for us is to expose this and to not let it fool us. So for example, if say Moon is taking direct action against Shell and Shell responds by greenwashing, it would be absolutely vital for that movement not to be tricked by the greenwashing, to reveal and expose the greenwashing occurring, and to keep pushing for change, keep taking direct action in spite of the greenwashing occurring until the actual necessary meaningful changes do in fact occur.
Okay, so that was really a very, very nice talk, and I think very nice answers. And I have a last question I want to ask. Oh, it's here. So someone was asking whether, so you presented a lot of, you presented the importance of disruptive action. And someone is asking whether you also see an added value of disruptive action when it's carried out by scientists and academics who are not only there as citizens, but really saying, yeah, I'm a scientist, I'm an academic, and I feel like this is what I need to do now regarding climate change.
Oh. Yeah, I think this brings me to a sort of general point, which is, what my argument here is that direct action is absolutely necessary and super important to win the changes we need. But at the same time, there are numerous other things that are absolutely important in order to support those efforts. So it is important that, for example, the movement can recruit people, convince people that we're right, and so on. And the role of scientists can potentially play, I think, a very important role in that regard. So typically they have certain privileges that other people don't have, access to the media, a certain kind of respect and standing. And they also have the advantage, of course, they have a great deal of knowledge and expertise that can really be leveraged when it comes to explaining these kind of things. And there's the added benefit here that many scientists are, in theory, the experts who know what climate change is and what effects it will have. And there's, I think, a really potentially good benefit to scientists then going on to take action, both more symbolic kinds and more direct kinds, because it shows that they're acting, these people who are saying there's a crisis are in fact acting as if there's a crisis. And I think this is understandably compelling and convincing to a great number of people. But I want to sort of make a sort of general point that there are lots of people who can't or perhaps shouldn't take direct action. Any kind of like large social movement that's built around direct action needs a huge number of people doing a huge number of things that are not direct action. They need people doing media, they need people doing on-the-ground organizing, they need people doing RSD support. Somebody has to like make food and bring cookies and just generally support people emotionally. There are so many things that movements need to get by and function that are not taking direct action. And no matter what kind of skills you have, no matter what kind of limitations you have, there's always something important that you, I am sure, can contribute to that movement, even if it is not yourself taking direct action. So even though I'm saying this is absolutely important, and if we don't do this, we will lose, and millions, perhaps billions, are going to suffer and die horribly, it's still the case that loads of people are really important who do not those things, but who do a variety of other things that keep the movement going, keep sustaining it, and keep enabling and supporting the direct action that happens.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. And also thank you, Elodie, for posing the questions. That was really enlightening, really enjoyable. I'm just going to close up the seminar today by saying that there will be a series of webinars, starting in about 3 weeks on the subject of degrowth. And I think that will also, a lot of questions that maybe have arisen from this talk, maybe will be answered by that series of talks. And if you'd like to know more about the Scientists for Future webinar series, you can find it on the website. You can also sign up for the newsletter through the website where you can get direct information about when the webinars will be. Okay, thank you very much for everybody who's watching live or watching this later. Bye-bye.